Alrighty then. Oh, sorry about that. I saw an Ace Ventura movie this weekend. I can never make myself stop saying alrighty then after I watch one of those. My kids are finally old enough that I can explain the things that have to be explained, and they can otherwise just enjoy a really kind of stupid, funny movie. So, been seeing a lot more Ace Ventura lately. Were there any questions I could answer for either of you before we got started today? Okay. Uh-huh.
I couldn't figure out how to, or if I could look at the publisher and see books that were under it.
Should be able to. If you have a specific instance of a publisher and you call the books method, the books method, you should be able to get back an array of books. Yeah. Is it that the books method isn't working?
Yeah.
Double check the publisher model and make sure it has the has many books instruction in it. It's actually that method call that adds the books method to the publisher model. So if that has many call is missing, the books method won't be there. Yes. And under publisher has many books.
Or was it belong to a category?
I thought it did both. I'm trying to remember. Don't publishers have many books?
It said have many authors, have one publisher, and belong to one category.
Okay.
Yeah, it's worded kind of strangely in the instruction. I don't know if that was.
There isn't a has one thing, is there?
Yeah, there is. In the one-to-one relationship. So a book has one publisher, but a publisher should have many books.
Mm-hmm.
Is that part in there?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and can have many books. So it is a one-to-many. So the book model should belongs to a publisher, and the publisher should has many books.
So it belong to category and publisher?
Yeah. Let's see. Books should also have many authors, one publisher, and belong to one category. So category will has many books, and book will belongs to category. Yeah, so books will belongs to a publisher and belongs to a category. Both. Does that help at all? Okay. Okay. Not meeting up in there somewhere, huh? Okay. So, yeah, lab's due tonight. New lab is posted. I'm a little worried with the lab. We've gotten a little bit further behind than where I wanted to be. So, kind of like this last one, we're actually not quite ready for the next lab yet. I went ahead and put it up. If we get closer to the due date and it doesn't look like we're going to make it, then I could, of course, extend it. The only trick to extending this next one is that we will be right up against spring break. So the due date that's scheduled for lab, what is it, 4 right now, is the week before spring break. If we push it back a week, then it would be during spring break. So I don't know. Not that big of a deal, really, but something to keep in mind, just in case.
When's spring break again?
3 weeks from now. It's what, the 3rd week of March, I believe? 2nd, 3rd week of March, somewhere right around there. Yeah. All right. Well, I do believe we finished up talking about our active record stuff on Thursday last week, which means today we're ready to start talking about views. Right? Be a nice little change of pace, I hope. Right? People tend to like the views a little bit better too because they, I don't know, in a way it feels a little bit more concrete. With active record, there's all this stuff going on behind the scenes, and if you know how to ask the right questions, it's pretty easy to determine if it's working or not. But there's nothing quite like views, where a page renders in a browser or it doesn't, one way or the other. So it really gives you something that you can actually look at, something you can see, smell, taste, and feel, in a way. I hope not really, but you know what I mean, right? So anyway, flashing all the way back to the beginning of the class, we talked about how Rails was built around this MVC design pattern. The M was for model. That was basically active record, which we have pretty much finished up talking about specifically at this point. The V is for views, which is the next thing we're ready to go on and talk about. Rails has a package that is a part of it, a gem essentially, called Action View, which is responsible for most all the stuff that we have to do dealing with views. So that'll kind of be the area that we're working in as far as the gem is concerned. The trick to talking about views is it is not possible to talk about them completely in isolation. We were able to, for example, talk about active record using nothing else. All we were doing was active record. There was nothing else, no other packages involved. That's not something that we can do with views. Views, of course, are the actual sort of front end of a Rails app. They provide the actual outgoing view of whatever it is that the app wants to be able to show, right, to the user, whoever that user is who's consuming information from the Rails app. Right? The trick is you can't access the view directly. Anytime a request comes in to see a view, it has to go through the router, right? It has to go through the controller, and only after it's gone through the controller can you then actually get a view to render and be returned back to you again. So I'll do as much as I can to keep from having to mess with those other parts, keep from having to mess with the router, keep from having to mess with the controller, and as much as we can, just spend some time just talking about the views, but it's not something that can be done 100%. So we will have to mess with routes a little bit. We probably will have to mess with controllers just a little bit. Okay? All right, so anyway, views, right? Let's see where to start. Well, how about the files themselves, right? Views in Rails are typically composed of HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, although they don't necessarily have to be. The actual output that a view sends back to a user can technically be basically anything. HTML, CSS, and JavaScript are, of course, the most common. What makes views interesting, though, is that views in Rails can also contain embedded Ruby code, right? So we'll have a lot of Ruby code, well, hopefully not a lot, but certainly some Ruby code actually embedded in our views. Right? The actual view files that we deal with are typically either called templates or called layouts. Layouts and templates are the two different types of view files that we'll be messing with most of the time. Okay? The actual template names, like these that I've put up here, right, have a certain pattern to them. Right? The file names for the templates themselves look a little bit strange at first because they have sort of two extensions on them. Instead of just being a name.extension, they're a name.extension.extension. Right? There's actually a pattern to how these names are put together. When you get used to it, it makes pretty good sense. Right? Essentially what you have whenever you have one of these template file names is the very first part of the name represents the actual name of the file itself. So index, list, feed, show, those are the actual names of these actual templates. Right? And usually, almost always, those names will match up with methods that are in a controller actions, essentially. So in some controller somewhere, there would be a method called index, and the file index.html.erb would be the view template for that particular action. Essentially, the view that would be executed and shown, right, whenever that action is executed. Right? In some other controller somewhere, there would be a method called list, a list action. Right? So list.xml.builder would be the actual view file that would be executed, generate the output that would then be returned whenever that list action is actually executed. So the first part of all of our template names is always just basically the name of the template itself, which usually corresponds with a controller action. Okay? The second part of the name then, what I have here is HTML, XML, RSS, or JS. That's the actual format of the data that's going to be returned. So for example, the index.html.erb template, by looking at the first two parts of its name, I can tell that this is the view template for an action called index, and its data that returns is going to be formatted as HTML. It's basically going to be an HTML view of the index action. It's one way of saying it. Right? The one called show.js.erb, right? That particular view template, right, is going to return JavaScript code. So JavaScript code is going to be returned whenever we access the controller action called show. Okay? So the first part is just the name. The second part is the type of data that's being created. The third part then is the rendering engine, right? Essentially, each one of these different types of files, each one of the different view templates is not typically returned as is, right? It's not just a static file that we typed up that then gets sent back to the user whenever they make a request of our application. Instead, a lot like PHP, there's an intermediate step where the user makes a request for a particular action, right, which is a controller method. That controller method goes out and gets one of these view templates, index.html.erb, for example. Right? What would then happen is the last part of the name, ERB, for example, right, is the name of a template engine that would basically execute that file. Right? It would allow us, in the case of ERB, to be able to embed Ruby code. ERB stands for Embedded Ruby. So it would allow us to actually embed Ruby code inside our index.html file. Right? That Ruby code would be executed. Right? The output subbed back into the actual template itself. And then the template, which is HTML, that responds to the index action, is what would actually be sent back. Right? So all of these file names all have that pattern to them. The first part is the actual name of the template. The second part is the type of data it represents. The third part is the rendering engine that executes that template, preparing it to be sent back to the user. You with me so far? Okay, very good. Okay, basically all of our different views, right, we've talked about this before, are going to be under the app/views folder in a new Rails application. Right? So let me go ahead and start up a Rails application. Let me spin up a new one. Right? I'm already here on my desktop. I'm going to do Rails new, and I'm going to make a new one called views example. Rails new views example. You all heard about Ruby 2, I'm sure, over the weekend. Yeah, you played with it yet? I haven't either.
Oh, did it get released over the weekend?
Yes.
I saw the news thing for it last week.
Yeah, the official release of Ruby 2 came out over the weekend.
Changed a lot.
Not a lot. It's not like if you jumped into it, you'd be totally lost. There's some new features, new things that it does now that it didn't do before, but most of the things that we were used to from the 1.9 version are still there, still work just fine. Okay, my new Rails app's been generated. Let me go ahead and jump over to that folder. I'm going to go ahead and open it in TextMate. Okay. And while I'm out here at the console, let me go ahead and generate a controller. Like I said, we're going to have a controller or we won't be able to access any views. So on the command line, I'm going to do Rails G controller. I'm going to tell it I want a new controller called examples. And then I'm going to put the word index, which basically means in the examples controller that's being generated, I want it to create an index method, an index action for me automatically. I'll go ahead and hit enter. New controller and all the auxiliary files that go along with it were created. The one last little bit of setup that I need to do before we're going to be able to play with this is in the application, under the config directory, there's a routes.rb file. in that routes RB file down towards the bottom, as a matter of fact, it's the very last commented line, there's a line that says match controller action ID format. I'm going to uncomment that line. That's a very generic route that will let basically any action in any controller be recognized using a standard URL pattern. So I'm just going to drop that in, which should then mean that we won't have to mess with our routes any more than that. Just putting that line in should be enough for us for right now. There we go. And since we are going to be working in views, we are actually going to have to run our web server. So back out on the console, I'm going to type Rails S for Rails server. That will start up the actual server itself. I can confirm that that's working then by going to my web browser and going to localhost 3000. If we get our little welcome aboard page, then our server's up and running. Our application seems to be okay for the moment. We all right so far? All right. Now, that line that I executed out on the console, right here, or out on the terminal, where I told it to generate a controller for me called examples, and I said I wanted it to have an index action. What that actually ended up doing for me was a couple of things. Under the app directory, under the controllers subdirectory, it made a new controller there for me called examples controller, and it put into that examples controller a method called index, which we would call the index action. Also, under the views folder, which is where all of our views are going to go, it created a subfolder called examples. The name of the subfolder matches the name of the controller, so examples controller pairs up with views examples. The index method, the index action in the controller then, has a corresponding view that goes along with it, index.html.erb, which it also created for me automatically. Okay. I can tell by looking at the name, index, and the fact that it's in the examples views folder, right, that that's going to be the view that goes along with the index action of the examples controller. Do you see the parity between those two things? I can also tell from the file name of the view, index.html.erb, that the expected output, what this page is expected to generate, is HTML code, right? And it's an ERB template, which means that I'll be able to use embedded Ruby code in it. Those things, of course, could be changed. We will change them later and experiment with making some other things, but generating HTML right now would be just fine. If I actually pull up that index.html.erb file, this is what's actually in it right now. Just an H1 and a paragraph. Okay. If I wanted to actually access this page in my browser, okay, that's where my routes file comes in. That line that I uncommented over in the routes file, this match line, is basically saying whenever we see a URL that has multiple parts separated by a slash, then the first part is the controller, then there's a slash, the second part is the action, basically the method name, and then there could also be another slash and an ID, and there could be a format on the end. But for right now, all we worry about is the first two parts. When we put together a URL to access our app, we would expect there to be a controller, a slash, and then an action. So that then means over in the web browser, if I wanted to access the index action of my examples controller, I would put slash examples slash index. with that URL, the path part of it, the /examples/index, will be handled by the Rails router, where it'll say, okay, examples is the name of the controller, index is the name of the action. That would then lead it to the examples controller, where it would then execute the index method. When the index method executes, that's going to tell it to render the index.html.erb view. Okay. So in my browser, when I hit enter there, that's what I get. Okay. The same thing that's here inside this file. Okay. If I put something else in this file, in my index.html erb file, and I go back over to the browser and hit refresh, there's my misspelled something else. There, fixed it. All right, so it's definitely that view that's being executed. Do you roughly understand how it is that we're getting there? Okay. The URL gets split up into controller and action names. Controller is found, action in that controller is executed. Okay. The action in that controller matches up with a particular view file based on the name. Right. That view file is then what is being executed, and in this case is just static text, static HTML code. Okay. But one way or another, it tries to render it. Basically, it checks it to see if there's anything in it that needs to be executed, any embedded Ruby. It finds none, so it just takes the page as is and essentially returns it, so that's what shows up in the browser. Okay. Okay, so what else can we put into these files, into our view templates? Well, of course, we can put any HTML that we might happen to want, any CSS, any JavaScript. At this point, you can think of this as writing any old HTML file. Anything you can do in HTML file, you can do here inside this file. No difference. Okay? But in addition to that, we can also embed Ruby code. Okay? How do we embed Ruby code? Okay? Kind of like when you're working with PHP. Remember in PHP where you had to put in the PHP tags? Everything inside the PHP tags would then get executed, everything else essentially left as is. Same thing with embedded Ruby. If we want to embed Ruby inside our files, we have to put in what are called ERB tags. Okay. There's a handful of different types of ERB tags, right? Kind of different variations on a theme. Right? This particular one, less than, %equal, and then ending with %greater than, is a very common type of ERB tag. I usually call these output tags. Right? Because essentially what happens is anything you put inside these tags is Ruby code. Right? And anything inside of them, the result of it being executed, will then be inserted right back into this position in the document. Okay? So if I did something like, let's put this in a paragraph. I'm going to say today is, and then inside those tags, I'll say date.today.2s short. A little bit of Ruby code. If I pull that up in the browser, I get today is 26 February. Okay. If we actually look at the code that was generated, well, it's awfully small down there. Okay. You might just see my paragraph tags. Today is 26 February. The ERB tags at this point are gone because, of course, what actually happened was when I refreshed the page, a request was sent to the server. Server parsed the path, the route, okay? Found the controller, found the action, found the view. Right? The view was rendered based on the fact that it says .erb at the end of the name. Rails automatically knew to render it using the ERB rendering engine. Right? In doing that, we went through the file, found all the ERB tags, which at this point is just this one set of output tags. It executed the Ruby code that was in it, and then the output from that, the value of that expression, got dropped right back into the file, substituted right back into the file at the position of the tags. So my entire set of output tags right here were replaced by the output of the date.today.2s statement. Yeah. So in the final outcome, I ended up with just today is 26 February. Nothing to it, huh? Okay. So I've referred to those as output tags. Okay. Next type of ERB tag that you might put in are these. Basically the same thing, but without the equal sign. Okay. Again, these are still just really ERB tags. These are all just different types of the ERB tag. But I tend to talk about them like they're different tags. The first one I said I call output tags. This type I call processing tags. Essentially with this type, the one that's missing the equal sign, what happens is any Ruby code that you put inside of it will be executed, right? But the output will not be put back into the document. So if you have Ruby code that you want to execute, but you don't actually want to express a value from it, you don't actually want to put a value into the page output, this is the type of ERB tag you would use for doing that. Okay? Like if I wanted to write a loop, for example, let's say I was going to go 1 through 100. Okay? For all the values of 1 through 100, I could write something like that. Now with that actual loop, I don't actually want to display anything, not from the actual workings of the loop itself. With that, that's just sort of mechanics. Okay? If I wanted to actually display something 100 times, I could take that something and I could put it here inside the loop. I could say for all the numbers 1 to 100, x, okay? And what I then end up with is 100 x's. So my little loop I produced, I didn't want any output from it specifically, but I certainly could have something inside of it that produces output. Right? Instead of x, maybe I want to show all the even numbers, for example. Well, maybe what I could do is inside the loop, I could use the output style tag. Right? And I'll say, show me the value of num if the value of num modulus 2 is equal to 0. So if it's even, essentially. Now from that line, I do want output to be produced. I either want to show the value of num or not. So if I pull that up, refresh my page, I end up showing all the even values from 1 to 100. All right. So the output style ERB tags, if you want to actually inject output into the page. The process type without the equal sign, if it's basically any other kind of Ruby code that's not specifically producing output of its own. Seem okay so far? Let's say that I have an array of names. Which type of tag do I want to write that array in?
Process.
Probably process, because I don't want to specifically output the array, I just want to create it. So let's say I have an array called names. I'll say we've got Victrola Firecracker, we've got Bernard Wrangle, and we've got Purdy Birdfeeder as names inside our names array. Maybe what I want to do then is I want to display an HTML table with 2 columns, one that shows a person's first name, one that shows a person's last name. Well, for the actual HTML part, I could just use the table tag. I'm going to turn on a simple border just to make it easier for us to see. I'll go ahead and create a first row to put my headers in. First name, last name. For the rest of the table, what I want to do is I want to create a separate row for every name that we have. So I probably should loop through all the elements of the array, iterate through the array. For that actual loop, I don't want to produce any specific output, so I'll use the processing style ERB tag. So I'm going to say for each of the names, do give me the name. More processing tags down at the bottom for the end of the loop. And inside the loop, for each name, I'm going to say create a new row. I want to split the first name and the last name apart. To do that, I could use Ruby's split method. For that particular statement, I don't want to produce any output, so I'm just going to use the processing style tag. I'm going to say first comma last equals name.split. I'm going to say split on a space. Then I want to have a set of TDs that has the first name in it, a set of TDs that has the last name in it. I have my first name in a variable called first. To actually output the value of that variable, I'll use the output style tags inside the first set of TDs. Same thing then basically for the last name. Output style tags with the last name variable in it, so those two values will be placed inside those two sets of TDs. I misspelled Bernard. And if I pull that up, that works fine. So that's basically it. That's the most important bits. Processing style tags when you don't want to produce output. Output style tags when you do. Whenever you request the page, the ERB engine will parse through your file, execute all the Ruby code that's in it, produce some form of output, HTML in this case. When it's done, that's the page that then gets sent back to the browser. So the browser never sees any ERB tags, never sees any Ruby code. The browser just knows that it's getting back what is hopefully valid HTML, also potentially CSS or JavaScript. Seem okay? Good. All right. There are a couple of other what I might call minor variations on these ERB tags. Certainly using them with or without the equal sign is the biggest, most important way, the biggest single most important difference in ways that these tags can be used, depending on whether you want output or not. Okay? But there are a few other little things that can happen as well. Okay? If we come over and we were to actually look at the code, for example, that's produced, look at my list of numbers. In the actual code, you see how the numbers are actually all indented and very, very spread out, blank lines between them. Right? It doesn't show up that way on the rendered page because, of course, the web browser strips out any extra white space. Right? If you're not especially concerned with how the code itself behind the scenes looks, or if you prefer it looking this way, then it's nothing to worry about. Right? But you do have a little bit of control over that. Right? You can get it by going in and inside your ERB tags actually putting in minus signs at the beginning or at the end or both or one or the other, basically however you want to do it. If I go in and basically put a bunch of minus signs at the beginning and the end of the different Ruby tags, the different ERB tags that are used there in that loop, if I go back and re-execute my page and go look at that list of numbers, you'll see it's quite a bit different now. Instead of a big long column of numbers, now they're kind of spread out horizontally, still with a lot of extra space in them. But we definitely did have an effect. Essentially what happens is when we put a minus sign inside ERB tags at the beginning or the end, we're telling it to trim off the next little bit of white space. So when I put in the minus sign here at the beginning of the loop, I'm saying get rid of the white space immediately before this loop. The minus sign over here at the end says get rid of the white space after it, which is basically the new line. Okay. Same thing over here, basically gets rid of the new line. Over here we get rid of some of the text off the beginning and a new line. Okay. It can be tricky trying to write Ruby code that is actually decent looking and readable and that produces something that's exactly what you might want in the output itself. But it's nice that we can at least have some effect. Although, truthfully, I don't tend to use those things all that often. If I maybe unindent that a little bit, pull the page back up, I have less space between all those numbers now. Okay. If I wiped out all that extra white space in there altogether, I can get to where the numbers have no extra white space. They're just side by side. Right? But I also now have some Ruby code that is fully left indented, which I'm not crazy about. So, tends to be a little bit of a trade-off. I'd rather have readable code here in the stuff I'm developing, slightly less readable in what shows up in the browser. But it's a little bit of a trade-off. Okay. The last little minor variation on the different types of ERB tags has to do with comments. When we put in the regular processing style comment, they can be split onto multiple lines, like this for example. Okay. I could create a variable, give it some value, do whatever else in here it is that I might feel like doing, just a pure little block of Ruby code essentially. I can also in here use just regular old Ruby style comments. Nothing to it. You can also, though, essentially turn an entire set of ERB tags into a comment by just making the very first character after the %sign pound. The pound sign. Since they are technically Ruby code, when we actually execute our page, there's no sign of our comments. They don't actually appear anywhere. Right? They're executed out just like everything else inside ERB tags. So generally you can put whatever comments into them that you need, not have to worry about them actually being expressed in the final output that shows up in people's web browsers. Okay. I also think they're great for debugging. Right? Usually when we run into errors, the actual error messages we get are fairly descriptive, make it pretty easy to find the problem. But always one of my fallback forms of debugging something is to comment out lines until a problem goes away. So if there seemed to be some problem printing out these numbers, for example, certainly one of the things that I would probably try would be taking those output tags there, turning them into comment tags, and then re-rendering the page and seeing if the problem goes away, just so I could be certain that that was the line that was causing the problem. Okay. I'll switch it back to a regular output style tag now. Yeah. So overall, the ERB tags are not too tricky. There's really the two big types, the processing type and the output type. There's also then the option of turning them into comments. There's the little minus sign trick you can use to try and control white space around them. But that's basically it. So whatever Ruby code you might want to write, you can write. Embedded right into a document of some sort, HTML document in this case. Okay. Do you have any questions? Okay. All right, so that's a quick little look at a template. If I come back over to my browser again, refresh, right, my numbers are all back. For the most part at this point, we can account for where all the viewable content of this page is coming from, right? We know why this H1's here. We know where these different paragraphs of content came from. We know where this table was made, right? We saw all that right here in this template that we've been playing with. Right? If we look at the actual code for the page that was received by the browser, though, right, we see all that same stuff down there, but we also see lots of other stuff. Right? We see that this is actually a properly formed HTML5 page. It has a doc type, it has the HTML tags, it has a head section. The head section actually has a title. It has links to style sheets and to scripts. Right? It has some meta tags thrown in there. It's got body tags. Right? There's lots of things that are actually in the output that's received by the browser that we did not actually put into our template. Where is all that stuff coming from? Well, under the Views folder, besides there being a subfolder for each of our controllers, like we've been looking inside the Examples subfolder that goes with our Examples controller, there's also another subfolder under Views called Layouts. And inside the Layouts folder, we have another type of ERB file. The ERB file that we've been working with is generally called a template. The file that we have here under the Layouts folder is called, guess what, a layout. Right? If I actually pull up that layout file, which is called application.html.erb, this is what we actually have inside of it. It's basically all that missing content, all that stuff that's being shown up in the browser that we didn't actually put there. All that stuff was actually coming from this file, this layout file, application.html.erb. The doc type, the basic structure of the page. Right? You can see there's already a little bit of ERB code in it. Right? There's a method in here being called style sheet link tag, which is saying to create style sheet links to the application file for all media. There's another method being called in here called JavaScript include tag, which is going to include a JavaScript file called application. And another method in here called CSRF meta tags. Right? It's those three method calls inside this layout file that result in the link, script, and meta tags that show up in the head section of our page when it shows up. Okay. This file is automatically generated for us. It was automatically made for us when we created our examples controller. Right? The same time it made the index.html ERB file, it also created this layout file. The basic idea with a layout file is that things that are general, things that are a part of basically every page or most pages on your site, you can put into your layout file. Right? At some point in the layout file then, there's typically a yield usually down in the body somewhere. Okay? What actually happens is whenever our Rails application goes to show our index page we were playing with a minute ago, what it actually does is it comes and it gets a layout file as a first step, starts executing the layout file, goes until it hits the yield. Right? When it hits the yield, that's when it kicks over and runs the actual template. So essentially, templates get embedded into layouts at the point where we call yield. So in my layout file, for example, if I put about to yield, and then I have the yield statement, and then after it I put done with yield, kind of like that. If I go pull that page back up in the browser, about to yield happened first, then all the content from our template. When our template's content was complete, that's when we were then done with the yield. So just inside the start of the body, we had the about to yield, then we had the inserted content from the template, and then we were done with the yield. So anything that we wanted to be a common feature to all of our pages, to all of our templates, instead of having to repeat that common feature inside every template, we could simply put it inside our layout file instead. Basically, Rails has already automatically sort of templatized our entire application for us, although we still have some pretty good control over it if we happen to want it. Let's play with something else. Let's see. I could go ahead and shut down my server. Back out on my terminal, I'm going to hit Control-C to stop my server. What I want to do is I want to generate another controller. I'm going to call it the math controller. And I'm going to tell it I want an action called factors and an action called multiplication. I'll hit enter. What it actually then essentially did for me was under app views, it created a new folder called math, a place to store the views for the math controller. Inside that math folder, it created HTML ERB files for factors and multiplication. Created some test stuff, some help stuff, handful of other things. It also created the actual controller itself. Where is it? Oh, way up here at the top. There's the actual controller. Okay. So over in my editor, if I take a look, under controllers, I now have math controller with those two methods in it. Those have to be there, but we're not going to do anything with them at the moment. Okay. Under views, a new subfolder created called math that has factors and multiplication in it. Let me start up my server again, Rails S, to start the web server. In my browser, if I wanted to access my factors page, what path do I need to put in the browser? What controller is factors a part of? Math, so that has to go first. then a slash, then the name of the actual action. The actual view I want to see is factors. So math/factors. And there it is. That's what I have on my math factors page right now. Okay. On this page, what I actually want to do is I want to create a table that shows a bunch of multiplication factors for the numbers 1 through 10, let's say. I'm going to edit what they already have here. I'll set the H1 to just be factors. I'll get rid of this paragraph. I'm going to put in some processing tags. I'm going to make an array. I'm going to call it factors. And all the factors that I want to figure I'm going to put in here. Let me start with 1. 1, 10, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000, 1 million. Let's do those factors. Okay. If I pull that page up in the browser right now, I really don't see anything because, of course, I'm using the processing style ERB tags. What I'm going to do next then is I want to create a table. In the first row of the table, I want to create a heading cell, a TH, for all of my factors. So processing style tags again. I'm going to say for factors, each do, give me the value of f. Right, so setting up a little loop there, little iterator. And I'm going to say for each factor, create a TH. And inside the TH, display the value of f. Maybe I'll say times f. If I look at that in my browser, there's the beginning of my table with those headings going across the top. It doesn't look much like a table, but because I haven't turned on borders. But I was going to come back and play with CSS here in a little bit, so I'll just leave it ugly for the moment. If I look at the actual code that's produced, that looks exactly right. All right. To do the rest of the factors then, I'm going to need a couple of loops. So let me do processing style tags. I'm going to say for the numbers 1 through 10, for each of those numbers do, give me the number, close off that loop. For each one of those numbers, what I want to do is I want to start a new row in the table. To actually fill that row then, I want to take that number and multiply it by all my factors. So another loop. I'll say for each of the factors, create a new TD. Inside that TD then, I'm going to put in num times f, the number times the factor. On my page then, there's my table. Six times 1,000 is 6,000? Oh, I've been getting that wrong. No, I'm kidding. Even I can do that math. This math is very much my speed. Just count the zeros. What do you think of that so far? Seem okay? Okay. What if we wanted to make it look a little nicer? Wanted to put a little CSS on it? I could go ahead and do that right here in my view template. I could throw some style tags in up there, a little embedded CSS. I'll concentrate just on the table. So I'll say for the table, border collapse, collapse. For every TD inside a row inside my table, I'll give it a border, just a plain old black border. I'll pad the cell a little bit, 5 pixels and 9 pixels. Maybe I'll give it a background color. CFC. So there's my lovely table now. What if I wanted to zebra stripe the table? Basically have each row alternate in color? Know what I'm talking about? Yeah. What if I wanted to do that? Well, if I'm going to control colors, I'd like to do it from CSS. So if I want to be able to differentiate between odd and even rows, maybe what I should do is make sure that every odd and even row has a different class. If I come back down to my actual code that's creating the rows for the main part of the body of the table, I'm going to say class equals, and then I'm going to stick some output ERB tags right there inside the quotes. Right? Output ERB tags don't always have to output something the user's going to see. It could output the name of a class or an ID, something that would normally be hidden from a user. I'm going to say output the word even if the number we're currently processing, we could just use the even method, couldn't we? Is even. I don't see anything different in my table right now, but if I look at the code, yeah, look, the first row class is empty right here. The second row class is even. Third row empty, fourth row even. So it looks like it put the CSS class in on all the even rows. So then I could just change my CSS a little bit. I'll say in my table, in the rows, any TD that has a class of even. I'll say set its background color to white. Oh, and it's not the TD, it's the TR.
Could you just put dot even on that and sort of it?
Potentially. I like to be specific in my CSS. Who knows what I might do later on that would then conflict with. There we go. Now I got a zebra stripe table. There's something we'll run into here in a while that'll moot that whole point, if that's even a proper phrase. Make that whole point become moot. Yeah, something like that. Okay. Seem all right so far? Okay. What's the disadvantage to the way I just did that CSS? Well, if I make another page that's a part of this application that also has a table on it that I want styled the same way, I would have to repeat all that CSS. Matter of fact, let's do that. Let's come over to the multiplication table. The multiplication view, I guess I should say. And let's see if we can make a multiplication table. Let's see, let's make a variable, call it max. I'll set it to 100. I want to create a table like I was doing before. First row of the table, I want to have all the numbers in it. So let me set up a loop that will go from 0 to max. And for each one of those values, it'll give me num1. I guess there I could have just called it num, couldn't I? Inside this row then, I'll create a set of THs each time we loop, where I'll just display the value of num. I want to pull that page up in my browser now. What would my path be to do that? Math/multiplication. There we go. It's a wide table. Maybe we shouldn't go to 100. Let me change the value of max to 10. Alright, a little more manageable. Okay. Next then, let me again say going from 0 to max. For each of those values, give me the num1. For each pass through this inner loop, I want to create a new row, and inside that new row I'm going to create a th, and inside that th I just want the value of num1. That's going to be like a header running down the left side, or at least that's the idea. Inside that row then, to create all the rest of the cells, I'm going to need another loop, some more processing tags, going from 0 to max. For each of those numbers again, give me the value of num2. And as we go through this inner loop, I'll create regular old TDs, and inside the TDs I'll just multiply num1 and num2. That should be close. It'll still have a little problem though. If I pull that up in the page, this is what it looks like. Like I said, it's close, but it's off by a bit. This last column over on the right doesn't seem to have a header. If you look at the actual values that are produced, everything else seems like it's off by 1. 3 times 1 right here it says is 2. 4 times 1 is 3. Basically my headers up at the top are shifted left by 1 cell. I didn't account for the fact that I was going to have that header running down the left side. So if I come back up to the top of my table, the header row, I'm just going to put in a plain TD right there. I'm just going to put in a little HTML comment marking that as empty so I don't wonder why it's there later. That pushes over that header row. Now everything lines up and we've got a multiplication table. Not super pretty though, is it? Definitely not. Okay. Why isn't it getting the CSS that I wrote before for factors? Because of where I wrote that CSS. Right? If you kind of follow the chain that happens here, okay, on the factors page, okay, I type in /math/factors in the browser, request is sent in, router parses it, takes us to the math controller. Math controller has the factors method. Right? The factors method then, okay, has a view that goes along with it, factors html.erb. Right? But before it actually goes and works with that one, what it does is it first gets the application file, application html.erb. Right? So it starts executing application html.erb, right? Gets down to the yield, and then at the yield point, it executes the factors page, which is where it drops in the CSS and the actual table for factors. Okay. Once the actual factors template is done executing, it goes back to where we yielded from, finishes up executing the application layout file. All of the output from all of that is then returned back to the browser, and this is what the browser sees and renders. When we go to the multiplication table page, very similar, we put in the route /math/multiplication. Router parses it, takes us to the math controller. Math controller has a multiplication action. Right? There's a view that goes along with it, multiplication html.erb, this file. But before it runs that one, it goes and it executes the layout file, builds everything up to the yield, yields to the template, so it builds the multiplication table, returns from the yield, finishes off the layout. Everything that was created then gets sent back to the browser, and that multiplication table page shows up. But what was missing? Well, we never executed, we never put in the CSS. Right? The CSS was part of the factors page, so the factors page was never touched during the chain of actions that were necessary in order to render the multiplication table page. If we wanted the multiplication table and the factors page to both share that CSS, then what we could do is we could take the CSS and we could move it up higher in that list of steps, put it in one of the steps that's shared by both pages. Like, for example, if I take the CSS out of the factors page and I instead put it into the layout, right, application html.erb, right, I'll just paste it right there into the head section of that file. That file gets executed in and around both of the two pages with tables, the factors page and the multiplication table. So with the CSS moved into the layout file, basically becoming a shared code between all of my different math pages. Then on the factors page, the CSS still works fine. And if I refresh my view of multiplication, it almost works fine. I forgot to put in the even. Pretty close though. if I want to put in the same striping on the multiplication table. You could do it the same way. Every TR is going to have a class or not. The class will be even if the value of num1 is even. There we go. Okay. So basically the layout file. Great place to put code that you want to be shared by all of your templates. That's really kind of its purpose. Instead of us having to repeat code over and over again in every template, we can put it into the layout file, like I just did with that CSS. If I wanted to add a little bit of navigation to these two pages so that I could get to them easy, I just want some hyperlinks. Instead of adding hyperlinks to the top of both of them, what if up above the yield in the body, maybe I'll just put in an unordered list with a list item in it, with a hyperlink. I'll make a hyperlink for factors that goes to /math/factors. I'll make another LI with another hyperlink in it. This one will go to /math/multiplication. Shows up at the top of the multiplication page, shows up at the top of the factors page. So by adding what we could call here my site navigation to my layout file, I basically added it to every page that's controlled by this entire application for the moment. Nothing to it. All right, I guess our question for next class then will be, what happens if we want a little bit more control than that? What if I have 10 pages that are all part of this application, but I only want 5 of them to share these certain features? The other 5 maybe are a different set of features or all independent. So we need to dig a little bit deeper into how these layouts actually work, how they're actually selected, you might say. See what other kinds of options we've got for working with them. Sound good? Any questions? All right, we'll stop there for today. I'll see you day after tomorrow.